My name is Guru Madhavan. I'm here to talk about a love affair that we as a society are having with efficiency. It's a concept central to our lives, so omnipresent that we don't pause to think about it. We created efficiency as a way to boost performance and save time and money. After all, who doesn't want more from less? As a systems engineer, I too was trained in that professional doctrine. Now with untold variants, efficiency has become much more insidious. What was once a way to escape the trap of wastefulness has now become the trap itself. In a society seeking endless efficiencies, no two are alike. I'm going to talk about 3 forms and 4 functions of efficiencies. Let's start with the 3 forms first. The first kind of efficiency is where engineering has achieved mastery in. Call them hard efficiencies. These are problem sets that are narrow and boundable. Scientific principles and market requirements neatly specify them. The efficiencies are directed, even dictated by customers, consumers, and clients. All the options and outcomes are planned. As an example, consider what happened a century ago. In 1917, months before the global flu pandemic, the Copenhagen Telephone Company was vexed about capacity problems from call congestion. Even with centralized switching, phone calls took about 15 minutes to be connected during peak load. If a network had more capacity than demand, service providers lost money. With less capacity, the calls dropped as surely as the patience of the callers. Enter the Danish engineer Agner Erlang. He published formulas to manage the teletraffic. He deftly applied statistics, modeling, and simulation to replan the network. The goal was to make the system perform reliably and at a lower cost. A capacity that previously didn't exist got manufactured and became dependable. By the early 1920s, about 1 in 8 people in the United States had a phone connection. Today, we take for granted the scale and efficiency of systems engineering required to maintain our far more complex internet and mobile networks. To better appreciate this, just imagine if COVID-19 had broken out in the 1990s at a similar scale and lethality. No broadband connectivity, no remote work, no video conferencing, no telehealth, no streaming entertainment, no contactless transaction, no online classes, no express deliveries, no real-time trading, and no Nudgestock. The health and economic consequences would have been worse. In scenarios such as these, one can mathematically achieve an efficiency, materially realize an efficiency. This is simply because of the sheer hardness of the problem, precisely defined requirements, and predictable behaviors. In the second kind, call it soft efficiency, the endpoints are unclear. Political constraints complicate the design. Let's go to a very famous example, a favorite of mine I've written about in my book, Applied Minds, How Engineers Think. As the story goes, in 1928, biologist Alexander Fleming returns to his lab after a break. One of his petri dishes containing Staphylococcus was contaminated by a fungal mold that destroyed infectious bacteria. He named the mold Penicillin. The initial response to this discovery was underwhelming because no one knew how to isolate penicillin. It took the pressures of the Second World War to drive the quantity production of penicillin. Enter Margaret Hutchinson, a chemical engineer with industry experience producing synthetic rubber and high-octane fuel for fighter jets. Instead of building a reactor from scratch, Hutchinson opted for things that were already functional. She revised a fermentation process used to produce food additives. Her team converted a rundown Brooklyn ice shop into a penicillin superfactory. Hutchinson's interbreeding of 2 disparate practices, fermentation research and petrochemical process control, laid the foundation for producing modern drugs and antibiotics. By August 1945, 650 billion units of penicillin were available every month for global use. Now, we can imagine a parallel with COVID-19 vaccines too. If the endpoints are clear, then it's a matter of hard efficiency. The softness typically emerges when the manufacturing and supply networks are rigid. We saw that when ventilators and intensive care beds were unavailable when most needed. Or think of the problems we had producing masks in the initial stages of COVID. In one company's case, the problem was not with sourcing the core ingredient, melt-blown polymer. It was in getting a compatible elastic cord for a mask's ear loops. The idea is not to make elastic manufacturing a priority, but to make the manufacturing system itself more elastic. Highly specialized efficiencies can create fragilities and can crash the system. Here's the point that all systems engineers know by heart. You cannot optimize a system by optimizing its parts separately. The third form of efficiency is what we might call messy efficiency. Here, values reign supreme, and efficiency can only be a starting point and never be the destination. Consider this heartbreaking example, driven entirely by the ideas of efficiency. Let's go to the lush green rice terraces in the Indonesian island of Bali. The farmers evolved an integrated system of organic farming and water sharing over centuries. This collaborative practice has been governed by water temples, sophisticated irrigation tunnels, and millennia of spiritual belief. If you bring upon the system of cultural evolution a technocratic, efficiency-based specification, say double the yield of rice, then you have disastrous consequences. That's precisely what happened in the 1970s. Farmers were supplied a high-yield variety of seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers to intensify rice production. The miracle rice produced miracle pests, anthropologist Stephen Lansing has noted. Plant viruses destroyed 2 million tons of rice in 1977. Efficiency, touted as a solution, was a scar and a toxic burden. We still have so much to learn about the cultural value and human perception of efficiency. The traditional Balinese approach was far superior to the new technology in getting the nutrients from volcanic rocks and preventing pests. Think also of the Ebola crisis that produced a global panic prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our focus was predominantly on new vaccine development, quarantine, travel bans, with almost no initial attention to the vital cultural traditions. In West Africa, much of the infectious spread was because of the long-standing burial rituals. A simplistic, efficiency-based approach crumbles in this case. This is clear from the cold cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness ratios we often consume as public policy advice. These economic efficiency criteria are inadequate, even flawed, for vaccine development and the broader global health issues. With these metrics, the Ebola vaccine would have never gained a priority score against other vaccine candidates. If one were to incorporate broader behavioral factors such as disease-raising fear and stigma, the pandemic potential, and disease eradication or elimination, the priority results would be completely different. In fact, a decade earlier, Ebola vaccine candidates did not meet the cost-effectiveness criteria of health agencies, let alone profitability criteria for vaccine developers. Even though several warning signs were present, we did not act on them. There are many more over-optimized calamities, all in the name of efficiency. Efficiency can work as an energy drink, producing a fast-acting gain at the expense of longer-term distress. The seductively simple notion of wanting to get the most out of least can have so many complications. That takes us to the politics, or the identity politics of efficiency. We just saw 3 forms of efficiency. Now let's look at 4 functions of efficiencies. They are toys, theories, traditions, and traps. The first and most familiar is when efficiency functions as a toy. The gains from efficiency come from simplification, even oversimplification. That's what makes countless conveniences possible, from frozen lasagnas to express delivered Nordic socks and the live streaming of Nudgestock. Each application is optimized for efficiency, piecemeal. Individual preferences are fine-tuned into parameters. Even as a toy, let's not forget, efficiency is a trait of means, not ends. The second function emerges when efficiency becomes a general theory. Over the past century, the factory floor concept has been exported to desk jobs. The typical 40-odd-hour work week with meetings, emails, calendar invites, teleconferencing, action items, you name it, is more or less a scripted show. We buy into the implicit theory that these optimize billable hours. They leave our work environments increasingly less nurturing. This debilitates productivity and creativity. The third is when efficiency functions as a tradition. Efficiency can be a fierce numbers game, a ritual in its own right. Efficiency thrives on rigidity, repetition, and rigor. We overinvest in quick returns, eroding other crucial areas such as arts, maintenance, and civics. Yet we consciously make these choices. This begs the question, is efficiency a characteristic of simplified systems or oversimplifying minds? The fourth and final identity of efficiency comes out when it functions as a trap. That's the idea of unquestioned goodness. Again, what could be so wrong with the idea of being efficient? The simple answer is that measures and metrics divorced from human behavior can backfire. Think of examples where the efficient solution had horrendous consequences. To become skilled in questioning the four functions of efficiency as toys, theories, traditions, and traps, we need to unmask our risky flirtations with its three forms: hard efficiencies, soft efficiencies, and messy efficiencies. That's how we can responsibly engineer efficiencies that don't just make us better off, but better humans. As we think of shaping a safer and more resilient world beyond COVID, we need to engineer a path beyond efficiency. That will involve behavioral insights. Instead of meaningless efficiencies, we should pursue meaningful inefficiencies. An idea from Eric Gordon, a scholar on civic media. If efficiencies are about meeting targets, inefficiencies are like speed bumps and stop signs on roads. They can help create safety, trust, and accountability. Of course, no one really likes plain old inefficiency. Our experiences with delays cause legitimate frustration, but other seeming inefficiencies can become meaningful when the context and conditions are reframed so that people can productively change their behavior and understand the consequences. You see, evolution advances with built-in limiters. Our kidneys are redundant. Banks maintain capital reserves for uncertain future risks. Our immune systems, too, are meaningfully inefficient in making adaptive trade-offs. They reduce inflammation while defending organ function. And if you need a 20-million-year-old example, look at bees. Their vagal dance is like a GPS for foraging that's evolved to be meaningfully inefficient. Bees and responsible engineers know how to balance exploration and exploitation. The upside of efficiencies and our fatal attraction to them is obvious, but we should also pause a little for reflection. We know the difference between a medicine and poison is just the dose. It's the same idea with efficiency. More is not always better. The opening four notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony are an emblem of musical efficiency. But the slowness that follows the stormy motif gives the creation its real vigor and vitality. Sometimes meaningful restraints can be as powerful as revolutions.
It occurs to me that in making ourselves feel efficient, by which I mean we're always permanently busy, we actually make the system overall worse, because someone with a permanently full in tray feels incredibly important and busy, but they're actually a bottleneck in the wider system because everything encounters a delay. Whereas if you gave that person a degree of slack and discretion over what they were doing, although they might feel actually slightly guilty because for 10 minutes of the day they didn't quite know what to do, the actual performance of the organization as a whole would be improved. And it's interesting, of course, you mentioned Taylor, because The United States got hooked on Taylor, which was a very, very unnuanced view. The Japanese had this guy, Edwards Deeming, who was more or less unknown in the US when he was a hero to Japanese manufacturing. And he said that there's an optimal level of slack in any system, and it's almost never zero. And it seems to me that we sort of, in a sense, we learnt from the wrong school somehow.
Exactly. And I think as behavioral insights have informed engineering practice, contexts do matter. Like, for example, you borrow and adapt the practices from jet fuel production to penicillin production. So I think across the different forms of efficiencies, the contextual applications are going to be important. Where endpoints are clear and well-defined, you can just basically translate them from one platform to another. But when you get to the messy levels, we really have to be careful with regards to the appropriate.
Do you think there's an educational problem here? Because what we think of as scientific from school, there is always a right answer. And we always have precisely the amount of information we need to arrive at that singular right answer. And so we pick up this idea from school that somehow there has to be a single right, unvarying, context-free answer. And that we try and recreate that kind of mathematical certainty in spheres of activity where it simply doesn't belong.
Yeah, it's a profound practical and philosophical question, Rory. Maybe suffice it to say that we have the single concept dominance in the way we are even cultivating our thinking around it. So it's a whole nother topic, and I know we'll have many viewpoints on this topic.
Yeah, I suppose it's too easy. I talked about this thing, which I called the Dorman fallacy, which I accuse Silicon Valley of doing this, which is essentially you define what success is in such a way that efficiency then achieves it. You lay credit to the intended effect, and then you've actually walked off the scene by the time the side effects or the unintended consequences start becoming apparent. And so what I mean by the doorman fallacy was you walk into a hotel, you look at the doorman, you define his function in a way that makes him susceptible to automation. So you say the function of the doorman is to open the door. You replace him with an infrared automatic door mechanism. You lay claim to the cost savings, and you essentially walk away having taken the credit, despite the fact, of course, that what you find 3 months later is that the doorman actually does many, many things other than opening the door. He recognizes regular guests. He provides a measure of security. He provides a measure of recognition. And actually, a hotel without a doorman can't really charge a full rack rate. And so it's very, very easy, I think, to define things deliberately narrowly in order to turn something into what you might call the first kind of problem, which is it's a simple optimization problem. And so we pretend a kind of simplicity in the models we devise.
Indeed, and one of the concepts that I know you're very familiar with came from the Japanese engineering mindset of delighting your customers, Kano's theory. And yeah. How do you really embed selective inefficiencies? And customer satisfaction became a primary objective achievable through many means. And I think if you apply efficiency in that kind of a portfolio, more polytheistic concept, it makes greater sense and allows you greater slack and flexibility in your design iterations, which I think is a little bit more liberating than confining yourself to meet very specified objectives that are not always the case with messy efficiencies.
And actually, it's the inefficiencies which, because they're discretionary, really deliver meaning, I think, in a marketing sense. It's the slightly weird things that the company does that it doesn't have to do. Mm-hmm. Then this is where Kano theory comes in. It's, if you like, the slightly gratuitous thing which carries the greater freight of the symbolic value of a gesture. And so politeness, if you think about it, is a form of inefficiency. And it has meaning precisely because it involves discretionary effort. You go out of your way to be polite. And so there's a huge danger that we create this kind of a dearth of meaning through over-optimizing what is effectively a kind of, a meaningless corporate behavior, I think. The doorman actually conveys an enormous amount of meaning precisely because he isn't an automatic door.
Yes, and I think business history is loaded with stories of how Nokia went about its design compared to Apple iPhone. And we knew who stood well in the market after that. So,
but I mean, I think the final thing, just to reiterate those things, it starts as a toy, then it becomes a theory. Is that right?
Yep.
What's in between theory and trap?
Tradition.
Tradition. So then it becomes unthinking. So the theory actually takes over. So it becomes essentially an unthinking.
Yeah, the spontaneous application. Yeah.
Okay, so, right, unquestioned application. And then finally, it's basically a trap.
Yes, that's right.
And so the toy is used, if you like, optionally. It's a tool. It's a useful mechanism for representing something in a way that might be useful. And then gradually you have this progression from toy to theory, to tradition, to trap.
Yep.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think that happens with all models, I think, which is they become increasingly dangerous over time. So this is fantastic, folks. I'm going to award a sort of bonus to the first person to go into a board meeting in any organization and to say, can we please have a working party to look for meaningful inefficiencies? Because I think that will be an absolutely transformative exercise. We certainly need it in our business. We're too busy to be useful, actually. Some discretionary time and some discretion over when you work and what work you do where would be enormously beneficial. So thank you for that. And see you soon in DC, I hope. Guru, it's been a joy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Rory.
Pleasure.